paternity. We are talking of the person of Mrs. Sarah Kurokekogha Richard Amachree. Late Mrs. Sarah Richard's father, Mr. REUBEN YOBU, was one of the 3 sons of late Mr. YOBU from Opuama in Egbema clan in Delta State. Late REUBEN YOBU of blessed memory was a great man in his time. He was an epitome of love, care, and strength. He was called, Egburu means strong man, by his people as a wrestler. Late REUBEN YOBU left his hometown with his daughter, Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree, to Rivers State after the demise of his wife, Mrs. REUBEN YOBU, the mother of Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree. Mr. REUBEN YOBU lived greater part of his life with his daughter and our children for his love for her. Mr. REUBEN YOBU sacrificed his life for his only child, Mrs. Sarah Amachree, maternity. Late Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree's mother, Mrs. REUBEN YOBU, NEE Ojiko, was one of 8 children born to the great and prominent family of Mr. Ojiko Okito and Mrs. Yenyen Ojiko from Polubobo and Ofunama, all in Egbema clan in Delta and Edo states. Mrs. REUBEN YOBU NEE Ojiko passed on after the birth of Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree, which made Mr. REUBEN the sole custodian of their daughter, Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree. Education. Late Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree never had a formal education, but ensured our children and those around her have the help of our beloved husband, late the King Richard Amachree. Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree married into the family of the royal family of King Amachree I. Sarah Richard Amachree's husband, late the King Richard Amachree, was the grandson of Prince Opukio Karibo Amachree III. Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree met her Prince Charming at a very tender age in 1955. Their love story was one that was made in heaven. Sarah Richard Amachree, the matriarch of Opukio Karibo Amachree's family, blended into the family and people of her beloved husband like the biblical roots. She embraced the culture and traditions of her beloved husband to the point that not so many people knew she wasn't a Calabari woman. Late Mrs. Sarah Richard Amachree stood by her husband to the end in both good and bad times. They both complemented each other, and their marriage was blessed with children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren. Hallelujah.
Live Productions, the entertaining Alex.